Stefan Zietara on Patrick Moore for episode 345 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We're amateur astronomers who love looking up at the night sky, and this podcast is for everybody who likes going out under the stars. Stefan was born on the border of Slough, United Kingdom, just off Herschel Street, named for William Herschel, and the site of his famous 40-foot-long reflecting telescope, which stood outside until just before Stefan came along. It was the world's largest of the time and sponsored by King George III. Stefan attached a picture of himself standing next to, I guess it's a replica or the remains of the telescope on a trip to the Royal Greenwich Observatory. So we thank you for that. Pretty cool. And Stefan, it seems like you were destined to be interested in astronomy.
Goodness, yeah, it does sound like that, doesn't it? With Polish, funny name I've got, it's Polish heritage. So both mum and dad are from Poland originally. And so all my kind of friends here call me Copernicus from that side. So to have a Copernicus link and a William Herschel link by almost birth, by birth sight, is quite an honour. Yeah, and it actually has sort of shaped a lot of my interest in the hobby, as I'm happy to talk to you about.
How did you first get interested? We'll just kind of start there. Like, what was your kind of first thing that really got you thinking about astronomy or hooked on astronomy, or what was it? Just sort of knowing that you were growing up in Herschel's backyard?
Maybe there was something in the chemistry there that was happening. But interesting listening to, I'm an avid fan of your podcast, been listening for a number of years. It's a great show. And some of the recent shows that you've that I've listened to, and some of the guests that you've had, I think we're all from the same era and generation, because they all appear to be sort of, they reply to this in the way that I will, in the same way, that we're from the sort of space era, from the 60s and 70s. So Apollo, it was a time of adventure, from the Apollo missions through to the Voyager probes and watching space shuttles launching, and it was an exciting time. So it was in the news. TV influenced a lot. We were getting transmissions in the sort of late 70s, early 80s from Cosmos, Carl Sagan, and I remember sitting down with my father watching this every Sunday night, and for the number of episodes that were there, and that was fascinating. And his delivery was great. And then Dad got the book, got the hardback, which I've now inherited. It's in front of me here now on my bookshelf. So, I treasure that from the 70s. And but it was only really probably a few years on, getting into my teens, where I sort of started thinking a little bit more about, what is it I'm looking at the sky and understanding stars. We'd go camping with school and friends, and you'd end up by the campfire looking up and what is it? And I couldn't by any means recognize any objects. I couldn't read the sky. So that was the prompt. I thought, right, let's do something about this. I got a book gifted to me from a neighbor, Patrick Moore book, on constellations, back in it was late 70s, and that was it. I was hooked. So I'd go out on an evening with my torch and sit out on a bench, no instruments, and just try and sort of understand the constellations and some of the star patterns and some of the names, and Polaris, and kind of went from there. We lived in Slough at the time, or near Windsor, so it was a big town, a big city, and lots of light pollution. So I couldn't really see very much other than the main patterns. And then a few years on, we moved north in the UK to more sort of countryside, where I started to see a lot more detail and the odd good night with Milky Way visible, and Dad would sort of report in saying, "Oh, there's an eclipse of the moon." So what's an eclipse of the moon? And we'd all go running out and with our binoculars. So he bought actually the first instrument that we had. Was a pair of 1970s Jena Zeiss 8x30 binoculars, which I have to this day, and they're immaculate condition. They're great binoculars. Not great for glasses wearers like myself, but fabulous way of just sort of looking at the moon and having a little wander about. So those were the kind of the start for me. And Dad was very interested, and sadly he was from a wartime generation that he wasn't lucky in life to own instruments or study it. So it was just purely a mathematical understanding and interest for him. So he would sit outside and he'd calculate the distance to the moon with his pencil and use trigonometry and, scribble it all down. So it fascinated me that, I'm sure he just looked at the Encyclopedia Britannica on the shelf and looked at what the average mean distance to the moon was and tried to impress his son rather than calculate it. But no, so those are sort of the deep-rooted background interests. But I mentioned Patrick Moore earlier on, and Patrick was on TV. He was, at the time, so in the 70s, he'd already been on air for a good 20, 25 years on his Sky at Night show, which was a monthly BBC Two late evening show, about half an hour, 40 minutes, and on all sorts of topics related to astronomy. And I captured a little bit of that with the landing on the moon. And so he was one of the main reporters and presenters of that show, but also linking in with the discoveries and what was happening in the space race. So that adventure was getting stronger in me. I wanted to understand more and was eager to watch his TV shows, and then the books started coming and reading a little bit more. Patrick was also not just visible on his show, but he was an eccentric character who had a fantastic sense of humor, and he really quite enjoyed laughing at himself. And he'd dressed up and he'd do silly things, as an alien or something, and appear on a TV kids show. So he was visible not just for those watching his evening show about astronomy, but he was also visible to the public. So he was an entertainer, and I guess the media exploited that. So we got a lot of Patrick Moore on TV in that period of time. So we got to sort of university time, and I still hadn't really looked through a telescope other than, the odd binocular here or there. And Halley's Comet in '86 was something that hit headlines. I was desperate to kind of find it. Didn't succeed. Sadly, I was in a city and really didn't know what I was looking for. But it kind of got me reading a little bit more about the subject, more and more. So when I finished uni, I remember coming out to this part of the world. I live in East Anglia, which is about an hour's drive from Cambridge, about 2 hours north of London, where I started work. And I was about to join an astronomy group called Norwich Astronomical Society when my father passed away. And I think that was the ultimate catalyst to really get me to go and start exploring this hobby for real. Maybe deep down I was looking for him somewhere. So I went along to the observatory, and it was an open day or an open evening, lots of scopes out, lots of interesting people. I was nervous as hell. I felt like a bit of an imposter. And in the corner next to the clubhouse car park, there was some guy there, and he had an LX200, a 10-inch. And that's ingrained in my memory because I'd seen it in the Sky and Telescope magazines. And I thought, one day I'd love to be able to get one of these. And there it was, first time I'd seen it. And he had, I don't know what eyepiece he had on it, probably because it was an open evening, probably not his best ocular, but it didn't matter. He was pointing it at Saturn. And I went across and I had a look and I saw the rings of Saturn, and that changed my life. It really was a really kind of, not only inspiration to move on, but I couldn't believe I was seeing a planet that well and that crisp and that sharp. Next to him was a guy with a Teleview Pronto who'd just acquired this little refracted telescope, and he had a 19mm panoptic in that. Remember that too. So I joined the queue and went along, and he was looking at, I think it may have been the double cluster in Perseus, and it was magnificent. It was three-dimensional, and it was clearer and sharper than the optics that I was seeing Saturn. But it didn't matter to me. It didn't matter to me at all how clear it was. It was the fact that suddenly I could see more than I'd ever seen before, and I just wanted more. So I went straight into the clubhouse. I got my checkbook out. I wrote an annual subscription fee to join, and became a regular weekly visitor to the observatory with no kit. But then suddenly, I'd seen the views through a telescope, and I wanted a telescope. And everyone kept saying, don't do it, go binoculars. And I thought, no, but I'm not going to see Saturn. unless it's 20 times magnification or something, and then I'll need a tripod the size of my car. So I did listen to their advice. I still had my little 8x30 Zeiss that I'd inherited from Dad. But I kind of had a hankering for a refractor. I'd seen the Teleview, the 101, which was my dream. Couldn't really afford one at the time. So I thought, well, I'll tell you what, let's go down the binocular route. Let's learn a little bit more about the night sky. There were plenty of telescopes at the observatory through members, but also the equipment that was there. And everyone was quite happy to allow you views through those instruments. So I started reading, and I came across some magazine blog, because in those days, I don't think we were kind of doing it the way we are now and getting access to information like on cloudy nights. And the big noise at the time was get yourself some Fujinon 10x70s. And it was either 10x70s or the slightly larger magnification. I can't remember what they were, but I thought, no, I wanted the wider view. I wanted something that I could reasonably handhold. That didn't work when they arrived. But anyway, so I ordered them, and there was a great exchange rate between pounds and US dollars. And I ended up buying a pair of those Fujinons from a very well-known New York camera outlet, who very kindly sent it. We imported it into the UK and did what needed to be done. And the box arrived some 3 or 4 days later, and it was an enormous box. And I remember opening this thing, and these binoculars just kept coming out of the box. They were huge. and compared to my 8x30s, which were, they were handheld, one hand sort of thing, I very quickly realized that actually I really wasn't going to be able to hold these for very long, and I needed a solution. So I got my back editions of Sky and Telescope out, and remember the adverts at the back, they had these little snippets from all the states in the US and some of the dealers. And what caught me was this little image. There's a little kind of photograph or a picture of a parallelogram mount from a company in those days called Virgo Astronomics. We're talking 1996, 97, around about that time. So I reached out, I sent a fax to Lucy Albert, who was the owner of that company. And we ping-ponged a little bit, and we made an agreement, and I ordered this parallelogram mount, which I thought was a fabulous idea. This thing came hurtling over from the US, and in the meantime, Lucy had sent me a letter in the post with what looked like a Polaroid photograph of Hale-Bopp, of the comet Hale-Bopp in early 97. And it was a Polaroid picture. So it wasn't going to be, high res, lots of detail, but nevertheless, there was this tiny little smudge, and it was a comet, and it was from the US, and it was destined to be the next best thing. So these binoculars started arriving, and they arrived, and the parallelogram mount came just at the right time to view Hale-Bopp. And as you guys know, it was just a spectacle, and it was really the launch of my interest at the observatory and with my friends there. So I took a picture. I took a picture from the UK and sent it back to Lucy with my old SLR camera, and developed the film, but forgot to pick up the film from the developers. Work got ahead of me, and I was passing by the chemist where the developing was, and I suddenly realized that 3 months ago I'd put this film in. So I walked in and I got mobbed. They said, "We thought you were never going to come back." He said, "Your pictures, they're great." And I've never taken an astro picture in my life. And, I just sort of read somewhere that, high ASA and Fujifilm 400 ASA film or something, and stick it on 1000 ASA and, and off you go, expose it. And it just kind of worked out. But what I didn't realize is that in the foreground, I had silhouetted the parallelogram mount with those binoculars on top with Hale-Bopp in the background. So that's what I sent to Lucy. So Lucy then rang me when she received it. She said, "Oh, can I please use this on, my mugs and I'm going to be doing some astronomy show, and can I, I'll pay you for the image, or I'll do something." So I said, no, you keep it. And we came to some arrangement. And so she's got a copy. I've got another different angle on it. And so that's as far as my astrophotography went, because then the visual thing took over. And I then had an international assignment with work. I worked for a big multinational company, and they sent me to Poland because of my heritage. I speak the language, and they wanted some commercial setup in Poland. So I came back from there. took advantage of the benefit of working overseas, and headed straight for the shop to find a TeleView 101. And there was one, actually a used one. It was a couple of years old, but it had hardly been touched. It was immaculate. So I ended up buying that with the accessories and with the Sky Tour and the caddy set and everything. So it had the digital setting circles. So that was my first venture into that. It was more push and point rather than anything electronic. And that was remarkable. Suddenly I had a high quality refractor and needed to get some eyepieces. So that was my entry into Cloudy Nights. And there was I think Astro ads as well in the US, and we've got an equivalent here in the UK as well. The UK buy and sell site. So I started arming myself with nicer eyepieces. Took my time, try to think ahead. So not just buy for the refractor, but maybe one day I would have that Schmidt Cassegrain or maybe a Dob, something that I could then not have to rebuy or rethink. Listen to Al Nagler's advice on eyepiece buying and the magnifications, etc. That was quite useful, I remember. And then one day there was I was subscribing to a UK magazine, and there was a closing down sale at a relatively local astronomy shop. And I wanted to buy a book and maybe get a smaller telescope for our eldest son, who was quite young at the time. I thought I'll maybe get him a little portable thing, and as an excuse for me to then card around sites when I didn't want to take the TeleView. So I went along ready for opening, just to make sure I got the good deal. And on his on the mezzanine floor where he had his showroom, he had a whole bunch of 8-inch Celestron SCTs for sale at knockdown closing prices. So I approached the guy. He was a well-known retailer here in the UK, and I said, "You wouldn't happen to have an 11-inch version of that?" And he said, "No, but I got a 9 1/4." So I said, "I'll have it," without even asking him the price. So with Legendary Optics, flat field, and that was the ultimate thing. So I came home. I went shopping for a book, and I came back with a telescope, which took a lot of explaining at home, I have to say. So that was great fun, and that became sort of my staple instrument in outreach in future life, because I felt that this was not only here in the UK, but my subsequent trips to the Middle East and astronomy shows in the desert. The Schmidt was portable enough to get me where I wanted to be, but it had sufficient light grasp also to really take advantage of some deep sky objects and show people galaxies and things up that they possibly wouldn't necessarily find easy to see in other instruments. The reality was that most of the outreach was planets and moon anyway, but those that wanted to see a little bit more, I had the instrument that I could just sort of GPS and go to quite quickly. And I love it. Had a few traumas with it, with electronic failures, and the date function sort of collapsed at one point, but Celestron did the nice thing, and they updated it for me and got a new hand pedal. So really those were the sort of two instruments, but I still deep down really, really kind of wanted to go down the route of big optics, big light bucket. I'd seen people's 22-inch reflectors before in the desert, and you reach sort of a different level of magnitude. It goes much, much deeper, and you're having to filter down planets. It is that much light grasp, and I quite like the idea of having maybe the 3 instruments and then vary the type of observing that I want to do. And so it was around 2010, 2011, something like this. I got my second international assignment to the Middle East with my company to set up a sales operation out there. But I didn't know which way to go. So I was in touch with David Kriege, and, I was obsessed about obsession. It's going to be an 18-inch classic, and Pyrex mirrors were running out and glass. And so, I was beginning to panic a little bit. And we'd planned a family trip from the Middle East to Australia to visit my uncle, who was my father's younger brother. And we were halfway to Australia from the UK already, so we thought that would have been a great opportunity. And I put a post out on Cloudy Nights, just like, I'm interested in this telescope, this obsession. These were my questions, and And I got one of those fantastic replies, not a one-line answer, but I got paragraphs from this guy with the detail and pros and cons and things to look out for and additional accessories and where to go from there. And I read this wonderful response, and right at the bottom he'd signed it John, New South Wales, Australia. And I thought, oh, we're just about going to Australia. So I reached out and I said, are you, how far are you from Sydney? And he said, well, I'm about 2 hours drive, and continued asking the questions. And he was 4 minutes drive away from where my uncle lived. So we were destined to meet. So I arranged a meeting with him. He welcomed me to his home. He had an 18-inch obsession, which was the whole start of the conversation, in his garage. We opened the garage door, and there it was, its glory. It was a lot bigger than I thought it would be, I have to say. And then he said, well, we've got some other instruments here. So we opened another 3 garages. And he's very, this particular guy is quite influential in the OzCamp, inviting lots of guests to Australia to view Southern Hemisphere objects. So he's got his own instruments, but he's also a custodian of a lot of others for the club that he then subsequently runs or helps to run. And there were these other instruments in there that were exquisite. I mean, they were smaller, larger, all based on that Trust Dobsonian design, kind of obsession copies, if you like, but made of different wood and with lots of added accessories and bells and whistles. So I said, what's that? And he said, oh, we've got a guy here in Australia who, brought a couple of these in and made a few for friends. And he's got a thriving business now where he makes these telescopes. And it's SDM telescope, size doesn't matter. And by the time we left Australia, I'd been in touch with him and placed my order for an 18-inch. And it took him a year. I was really lucky because, I think now Peter has got, a waiting list of a number of years. At age, he's a senior gentleman, let's put it. But he's got a lot of telescopes on order, and I think he's only made about 100 or so since he started, getting on for 15, 20 years now. He's been building these. It's a different business model to the Obsessions, where they, 400 or 500 a year versus maybe 1 or 2 a year. So the build, perhaps a bit like the Tita telescopes from in the US, high quality cabinet making, etc. So anyway, I ordered this thing, and he built it. He shipped it out to Dubai, and I've named it Zeus after my dad. That was his pseudonym in World War II. So that's my kind of homage to my dad, who never got to look through a telescope ever, but was my kind of guiding light. And Zeus obviously has other Greek mythological connotations, god of gods and Jupiter, etc. So there's a little bit of a link there. And Peter Reed, he personalizes the scope for you. So there's a nice plaque on the side to show its name. But it was tremendous. And certainly from the climes of the Middle East, we were based on the outskirts of Dubai for about 8 years. And I'd wheel this thing into my 4-wheel drive, and off I'd go into the desert. Not when it's blowing a hoolie, I have to say. But, when the conditions were right, to have a show with people, even just privately with friends or myself, or doing outreach, the queues were substantial, I've got to say. This was part of a club. It was part of Dubai Astronomy Group. We were probably a group of about 10 people who were involved in creating some outreach for locals, and also carrying on go back to Patrick Moore. One of Patrick's wishes is to spread the hobby, spread the science in outreach, because that's really what he wanted to do. And he wanted us, a handful of people who knew him, to continue what he'd started. So I felt obliged to follow that. So we did a lot of sort of shows in the desert, and a lot of people would come along, and probably 20, 30 people on an evening. But then we had a surprise visitor. We had a surprise visitor in a meteor shower that had never been witnessed by certainly not in living times. And this was in April. I think I've written it down somewhere, but I can't remember. There was a Camellia Par Dallas meteor shower, if I'm not mistaken. and it was due to pass through Dubai first, or that part of the world first, in terms of its position. So there were three of us, a school teacher, but all three of us are Brits, one Scottish school teacher, science teacher, and a business owner out there. We got together, we thought, how can we bring this meteor shower to the public? So we got a Facebook page together, and one of us, who's a little bit more kind of TV aesthetically pleasing, wasn't me, it was the other guy. I went on and talked about it, and there was a radio thing, and we got the hotel to get a space available for a number of cars coming down to use their facilities. And we got close to the day. It was planned maybe a month in advance, and it came to the evening, and we estimated 8,000 people turned up.
Wow!
It was I jokingly refer to it as a Justin Bieber concert without the lights. It was insane. We were manning 4 or 5 telescopes in the grounds of the hotel with the lights down from 8 in the evening till 6 in the morning, non-stop. I mean, our batteries were failing. We were dehydrated. People were bringing drinks. There were queues waiting to get to the hotel. People abandoned their cars and just camped in the desert to look at the spectacle. Sadly, there were not many meteors to be seen, but there were views of Jupiter and Saturn at the time. And so people were kind of getting a good eyeful of that. And we definitely made our mark on the region when it comes to OpenReach. So there's a lot of interest. So the three of us, we were gifted breakfast by the hotel because the guests arriving had cleaned them out of all the food and beverage completely. So we had a little bit of a whatever was left over in the morning, and sort of said, well, what just happened? How can we continue to do this? So long story short, we managed to get alongside an events company with some royal connections to use royal land, and we were doing public outreach for VIPs, for guests. So that was a tremendous experience, because you're not only meeting some great people, but you're in a part of the world where the night sky is pretty much guaranteed to be quite good every night, almost. So certainly statistically.
I was going to ask, Stefan, how were the skies there? I remember I did a remote event with a group from that region once a couple of years before the pandemic, and I remember they were showing me, basically what the sky looked like out in the desert there, and it was just almost unimaginable. It was so dark. And how far south? You could probably see a little bit further south from there, I imagine, than from where you are in the UK.
Yeah, great question. And to catch the first bit, it was dark. I've been to darker sites, but the quality of the sky, the seeing and the transparency was so good, it actually illuminated the sky, which made it look less dark, if that makes any sense. But it was horizon to horizon. We're talking, I was based around probably about 4 hours out of Dubai, due south towards the Saudi border, and about 2.5 hours south of Abu Dhabi. It's a straight road, which actually goes through the tropic, 23.5 degrees. So Dubai's at 25, I think. So yeah, you're a bit further around the corner to see further south, which is remarkable. I'll come back to a point actually in terms of the first thing that I saw in my telescope from Dubai, because it was a specific thing I was interested in seeing. But the sky in the desert is that the desert has a pulse. It's alive, literally. And if you're lucky, you get to a certain time of the day and everything settles down. There's less wind, and it depends on the time of the year and the temperature. But in the winter
next, you're going to tell me you really like the desert because it's clean. Anyway, sorry. Reference to Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, it's not far from where it all originated from, down there in Yemen. But it's just a remarkable place, and there weren't many times when I was lucky enough to be out there doing these shows or just looking that it wasn't crystal. So I would say Bortle probably 2, that kind of area. But and when you're looking at the constellations, you'd see some of the fainter stars that you wouldn't generally see from Europe, even with the star chart or naked eye. So that was remarkable. But going back to your last point, around the corner, seeing a bit further south. When Peter Reed made my scope, my 18-inch, one of the things that he tested it on was a Megan Centauri from Australia.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought it would be really cool. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to see Amiga Centauri and then report back to Peter and saying first and last objects spotted in the other reverse order. It was probably at about 5 degrees off horizontal. So I've had a friend of mine who was just helping me guide the telescope down because it had hit its limits and it wouldn't go any further without, shutting down the electronics. So I manually guided it down without it touching anything. But I saw it. It was there, and
nice.
it was the most remarkable globular I've ever seen. It filled the whole view. So so that was quite cool.
All right, let's get on and chat about Sir Patrick Moore. Can you tell us?
Well, Patrick, he's sadly no longer with us, as we know, but he's a gentleman who was famous for being the presenter of The Sky at Night, which was up to the point where he passed away, was the longest running TV show by a single person in history. I think it ran for 50 odd years, 57 years. Sky at Night was a once a month program on the BBC. He had a personal relationship with Armstrong and Aldrin, many of the other astronauts, as well as other famous scientists. So he was well known. How did I get to know of him? Well, we talked about the books. We talked about the shows that I watched. But one fine afternoon, he made a visit to the Norwich Astronomical Society that I joined back in the mid 90s with the BAA, with the crew. And so we had to spruce up the site, and he came along, and there was a lecture and a talk, and then he toured the site, and I got some private time with him. And I don't know, for the benefit of that, that's the picture of he and I going back. I look a little bit younger then. I can share this electronically with you.
Yeah,
that's the first time I met him personally, just found him a really nice guy. Always had time for people. Mentioned his sense of humor, his knowledge on all matters astronomical was vast, but his specialty was the moon. His real passion was the moon. He wrote a lot of books, so he classified himself as not an astronomer, but as an amateur and as an author. That's how he described himself. Main topics were the moon. But there were annuals, there were periodicals for the BAA. He contributed. He also sat as president of the BAA and the lunar section as well. So he came along. We chatted about his interest in astronomy. I was a bit awestruck by him because he was a celebrity, and then I didn't get to catch up with him for another couple of years. But then through a gentleman called me up with work, and he said, look, I've got some work very close to Chelsea, the south coast where Patrick lives. And I know him personally. Would you like to come along? He's throwing a luncheon. Do you want to come and meet him? So, of course, I said yes. And so down we trotted. And Patrick had about sort of 20 people in his house, Farthings, which until quite recently, I thought Farthings, the home where he lived, that's what it was called. It's actually Far Things. It's a play on words. It's things that are a long way away. So
I thought it because he didn't have two like pennies to rub together kind of thing.
That's exactly what I thought. Or I thought because he was such an old guy that it was a bicycle with a big back wheel, But no, it's Far Things written together. So it was just a show of his humor. But it was this beautiful cottage in Chelsea, which is on the south coast of England, with a thatched roof and with lots of little rooms and quite a plot of land with all these outbuildings, where I then later discovered he housed a lot of telescopes. So I got a tour of the site, which was fantastic. The most impressive for me was the fuller scope, which was the 15 and a half inch, maybe 15 inch, I can't remember exactly, reflector that was
it was in a strange building. I think I recall. I've seen a lot of videos of it. It looks like almost like a greenhouse with windows around it. Yeah, very interesting.
I think it was an oil drum. I think it was like an oil container or something of that nature, and it had just been cut and adapted into an observatory. Very efficient, huge building. I mean, you could probably, the reflector, 15-inch reflectors, are a decent sized instrument. But he'd go in there, and we'd probably be about 15, 20 people, and you still had elbow room. So it was a big spot, and would certainly take a larger instrument. So that was quite cool. I never looked through it because it was undergoing at the time some renovation work. So it was there on display, but the optics were out. The tube was there. But he had a runoff roof shed. He had a number of refracting telescopes in his study, kind of older brass tube ones, which were working instruments, not decorative ones that he had from his younger days. And then entered into his library, which was just it was most incredible place, because he had stacked, absolutely stacked books.
I got to ask you a little bit more about those observatories, because one of his famous ones is sort of that split building design. Although building is not like a building I think he did like a 12-inch reflector on a yoke, or a yoke mount of sorts. It looks like a giant version of the Teleview Gibraltar, basically, and the building would just separate in two on runners, and then the telescope would be in the middle, and he had a set of stairs to kind of go up and down to reach higher altitudes. Did you get a chance to look at that?
Again, that was a lot of his at the time. The time that I met him and I was at his house, he was already an aging gentleman. So he was probably approaching his 80s, if not already 80, from memory. So the instruments weren't getting the use that they did in his earlier days. So a lot of them had gone into sort of ill repair and needed a lot of care and maintenance. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see through any of his instruments, because they just weren't, they weren't really adequate for any visual observing, but they were there. But I remember the instrument and the runoff shed that you're talking about, because it was quite relatively close to his main house. It was probably his closest one if you come out the sort of side door. And it was in a sort of, I can only describe as a greenhouse. So it had glass windows, with some sort of little curtain runners that he would close just to keep sort of a stray light away when he was using it. But that particular instrument, I believe he did a lot of work mapping the moon. So he did,
that's the one I remember him talking about. Yeah.
So he did a lot of that, and the work that he did was during the space race. He was actually sort of supplying lunar imagery, sketching imagery, to both NASA and also to Russia. So he wasn't biased in any way. He was just supplying that kind of detail. I on one visit. This first visit turned into many more, thankfully, and we became good friends. So I knew him for getting on for about 15 years, on and off. And on one particular visit, there was it was usually linked to either the filming of Sky at Night, one of the episodes, because he couldn't get to London anymore. He was getting frail, to speak, and BBC would come and do all the recording there on the spot in his study. And he was giving away a couple of the printed moon maps that he'd made, but he'd signed them. And on one of the visits, which was the 50th anniversary of the Sky at Night, that was a splendid thing. BBC put on a couple of marquees in the garden. Several hundred people attending, some of them quite famous, and there was a moon map there, a sort of a blown up version of it that everyone could sign. So I added my little scribble to it, and then that was a day where digital cameras were in existence. I had a really kind of a 3 megapixel something or other, so I stood on a chair and took a picture of this thing. So somewhere in my archive, I've got a copy of all those signatures that you can zoom in on. We really did become good friends, and privately, and it wasn't just when the filming started. Family came around, we had supper together, and got to know him as a person as well as the celebrity. And there was a bit of an on-off switch between the two. He was always an eccentric. I think that was the generation. The monocle, which was, as far as I know, was for real medical reasons. His 2 eyes were not quite spliced together correctly, so he compensated for that. But that made the character, and he played on that, so he knew how to do the celebrity thing. At the end of the day, he's one of the sort of pioneers of early television, with broadcast, etc. But yeah, he knew how to play the crowd, definitely. Getting to know the inner Patrick was a real privilege. One example was I got a call from the BBC where they were about to film the Transit of Venus event back in 2004. It was a 3-way TV show based, one at Greenwich at the Meridian, at the observatory there, one at Patrick's Place, which was the sort of the core of the Sky at Night, and one up in Leeds in Yorkshire, which was the home of Jeremiah Horrocks, who was the first to predict.
That's right. He projected it through a curtain on against his wall. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a 3-way kind of a TV thing, which was fascinating, and I was really lucky to be invited along to the filming of that, and to the not just the filming, but just to participate and experience the whole event. And we had unusually a beautiful, beautiful day, summer's day. It was warm, it was sunny, it was hot, and I got to spend quite a bit of time with Patrick privately in his garden, sort of reminiscing about his old shows and some of the people that he'd met, and his favourite producers, who he'd travelled the world and visited some of the observatories that he did his shows around. So that was special. That will never leave me. And it was only a few years later that he had another anniversary. I think it was his 777th show, which tied in with his birthday. And this was being hosted again at Far Things just before we left for the Middle East. So I went along, and a lot of people there, some very interesting characters, and kind of said cheerio to him in a way. And he said, "Oh, where are you off to?" And I said, "I'm off to the Middle East." And he said, "I've got a friend in Abu Dhabi," and he opened his drawer at his desk next to his famous typewriter, and he gave me this piece of paper, and on it was written a telephone number with his friend. And he said, "When you go, make sure you contact this person." So he had contacts, he had influence, and beyond the shores. So which I did, and sadly, about 18 months down the line, I got a call, and they said that we've lost Patrick, and that was a sad day. It was a happy day that he wasn't in any way in pain. He struggled in his life a little towards the end, but it was kind of end of an era, and we had a mission to continue some of his work and to make sure that we showed children and students the night sky. And so it goes back to right at the beginning. What I said is I love visual. I love showing people through the telescope. It's kind of not only a mission to carry on what Patrick did, but it's a genuine interest. It's fabulous, our hobby, isn't it? It really is.
One of the things that I really liked about Farthings was on the roof, he had like one of those weather vanes or wind direction pointers, and it had like a little person with a telescope. And I so want one of those still.
Actually, now you say it, I'd completely forgotten about that, and I may even have a picture of it somewhere. Because I knew
I'd love to see. I tried to find one when we were doing this. I tried to find a picture of it, but I couldn't. But I remember because I used to watch The Sky at Night when we're at my grandmother's, and I was a small child, and I remember like the camera would sometimes pan out from that to Patrick. Of course it'd be like totally cloudy, and then you'd be saying something to the effect of, "Well, we've got no skies here tonight," kind of thing. And
it's clouded out, no chance.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that weather vane. I do remember it now. You mentioned it, Chris. I do recall it. I've got it in my mind's eye, and it was there on top of his thatched roof. And a lot of houses here do have weather vanes. Brits are kind of sometimes a bit obsessed about the weather because we get an awful lot of it. But you can buy these things. Our next door neighbour has got one with I think a horse and cart or something or other, which collects the. So I'll keep an eye out for you, and I'll send you some images if I find.
Yeah, sure. And if you could, sort of nip it, that'd be great too. Yeah.
I don't think they'll let me in because he's now owned by somebody else. There's a plaque now that that was unveiled by Brian May quite recently to say that, in honor of Patrick, but it's now owned by somebody, and I don't think they'd appreciate me climbing their roof and stealing their weather vanes.
So is any of the astronomical equipment in that still? I remember there was some talk at one point in time. I think I remember hearing Brian May speak about possibly trying to turn it into some sort of museum or something to that effect, or what's happened to all the library books and equipment if not there?
Yeah, so again, another really good question. It got a little bit controversial after Patrick passed away, and there was a lot of inaccurate bad press around the whole thing. It was a bit distasteful, but the reality is that the house was in trust, and it needed to be, let's just say, correctly catalogued and handled. So, Brian May did a fantastic job with a number of other people to ensure that not only some of the possessions, but some of the very valuable things in there that he had, value not in monetary terms, but value in terms of the meaning of things and that type of thing, went to the right place. So I believe there is a local astronomical society close to where Patrick lived that he was associated with. I know that they received, there's some affiliation as well with the Science Museum in London that they have. So they received quite a number of the instruments and some of the possessions and the books. Some things were gifted, some things went to charity, and a number of things were auctioned. And I was aware of the auction. I didn't bid for anything. For me, the memory's enough. I didn't even go crazy with photographs when I was there, because you don't go to your friend's house and take a load of pictures of them or their possessions, I guess. But the memory was enough. So my understanding is that things that were important are in the right place for the right reasons, and some of them are accessible and on display. It's a case of just kind of having a bit of a dig around and seeing specifically. I think the telescope you referred to earlier, Chris, is one of those things that you can go and see. I know the Fullerscope was being restored. There was some ping pong on cloudy nights around this a little while ago, and I contributed to that. So I think there was some work going on in terms of bringing that back to life and having it as potentially a working, example for the public. So no, that's a good thing. And the house remains where it is, and I think it's been respectfully. It's a listed building, I'm guessing, because it's quite an old property, and it's we're custodians of some of these properties during our life. So whoever's got it now will be doing the same for the next generation, and it looks great from the pictures I've seen, certainly in the press.
Did you get to meet Patrick's cats? That's my question. Yeah.
Ptolemy, yeah. Well, he had a few, but yeah, Ptolemy was, lovely cat, black and white with a little white kind of collar thing, or black cat with a collar. There was an interesting sign, I remember now that you mentioned. So you'd park the car down the side of the house, and there really wasn't a front door. It was more of a sort of a side door to the house. And it was a sort of a lean-to glass construction, which housed a telescope from memory. And then there'd be sort of the main door. You'd go into this area, you'd close the door behind you, then go into the main house. But there was a sign on the door, and the sign said something like, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was, this is like a vacuum. The space you're in is a vacuum. Please make sure you close all doors before opening into the house so the cat doesn't leave. So he loved his animal, and played a big part of his life. And I think he had some charity work for animals as well. And, cats were a big thing for him and his mum, I think, as well in the past. So, yeah, I did meet Ptolemy on one occasion. I think, I'm not sure it was a he or a she, but Ptolemy was, I'm guessing it's a he, was asleep on the typewriter. And he had a little spot next to the desk. It was like a little plinth, and there was a cushion, and he was always there asleep or being part of it. He wouldn't allow him in the next room where he had his mini grand piano and his glockenspiel, like a xylophone thing. Yeah, that was strictly no go.
All right, so maybe we can just talk a little bit about the Caldwell list before we conclude. How does that sound?
I listened to a few shows back, and what prompted us to kind of get in touch, I guess, was what struck me. What I meant to say is what struck me is how much negativity there was around the Coldwell list. And I'd really had not heard that before from any point of view. So I wanted to understand that a little bit more. So one of your guests, Alistair, I was listening to Alistair, great show. I was really into it. And it was about lists, I believe. And I'm trying to get myself a bit organized now. I'm sort of a little bit less work in my life to kind of go about life and list things and do things in a sort of a structured way. So I was taking notes, and he got to the end of the show, and he was quite vocal and quite, he had his opinions on the Coldwell list. And I was quite surprised because I've not really heard that before. So what it prompted me to do is it prompted me to have a little bit of a dig and to try to understand why there is this, what I classified as negativity. So the first thing port of call was, where did it all emanate from? I knew Patrick, obviously, and I knew that he created it, and I'd had discussions with him. But the Coldwell objects were already up running by the time I met him and knew him personally. So this was a few years before then. But I recalled the story that it all kind of happened through Sky and Telescope. So I dropped Sky and Telescope a note saying, I'm trying to get hold of a back copy. Can't seem to be able to do it. Can you help me? And they very kindly wrote back, and they said, look, don't copy, don't send, don't do anything. For your research purposes, here's the article that you're looking for. So I read it, and I was quite shocked at the opening few paragraphs, because they appeared to be a statement from Patrick announcing the validity or the rationale behind producing these Coldwell objects, this list. And some of it did appear, as I read it, to be quite arrogant, may I say, something that it didn't ring true. What I was reading didn't kind of, to me, balance with the person that I knew. So I reread it a couple of times. I read a couple of others. I've got the Coldwell Objects, the Deep Sky Companions, wonderful book, Stephen James O'Meara with some of his others. And so I kind of dived into that and the opening, and it was a slightly different intro. Perhaps it was clearly done after the event, so maybe it had refined a little bit. And also with Martin Mobley, who I also met through Patrick, and he'd also written a book about this, and he was quite explanatory in his preface and entry. So anyway, that was kind of my take, and I thought, right, is this really something that was done in the style that was presented in that opening statement of Sky and Telescope? And in my view, it's not. I think it's a misinterpretation, my personal view on this. I think what this is Patrick. Okay, let me just sort of step back and rewind a little bit. In my early days of astronomy, we'd start with a Messier catalogue, and we'd have a little look around, and we'd say, well, why didn't Messier pick that up? It might be such an obvious object that, did he see it? He didn't think it resembled a comet, therefore he didn't catalogue it. Perhaps, who knows? But as amateurs and as friends, we used to then make up our own little lists of those things that potentially he missed. And I think I know Patrick, we had that discussion as well, saying there's clearly omissions for whatever reason. So wouldn't it be fun to create your own list? So there were discussions at our local observatories, as well as in Patrick's house, of let's just write a list. And in fact, I did one. So I created one, and I couldn't call it a list with Messier, because that wouldn't work. So, let's call it something else. So he got together and I specify the word list rather than a catalogue. And it was just a list of his favorite objects that happened not to be Messier objects. And my understanding is that's exactly how it was meant to be. Nothing more than that. And yes, there were some more southern hemisphere objects that Messier wouldn't have seen. It wasn't competing with him. It was more complementary to him. And there were some things that were perhaps a little bit fainter, that would be harder to see, or very hard to see unless you had larger instruments. But to Patrick, that wasn't the problem. The point was that it's just his list. It's just a list of objects that he liked, that he quite fancied. He bundled together, put it in an envelope, and sent it to the US to Sky and Telescope. And out of it came, as we know, a list, an official list, a catalogue, perhaps. Depends how you define it. I tried to look at what's the difference between a list and a catalogue. It's quite a difficult thing to get in your head. But to him, to Patrick, it was always a list. It was always a thing for himself. It wasn't a serious thing. It wasn't meant to offend the Messier objects. It wasn't meant to, in any way, as was stated in that first paragraph in Sky and Telescope. I don't believe Patrick wrote that. And if he did write that, I think it was in jest. It's sort of saying, I'll just open this up one moment. I'm sorry. It says here, sites are shamefully neglected, quote unquote. That to me, knowing Patrick, was a joke. It wasn't that shame on Messier for missing these out, therefore I'm going to correct him in an arrogant way. It was more, oh dear, look what he's done. This French person hasn't quite got it right, so I'm here to correct him. Ha ha. Old style English humor, perhaps. But I think if you didn't know him, and if you read that outright, you could very easily interpret that as a very arrogant stance and be on your back foot and possibly not like where that's coming from.
So maybe not meant to be printed word for word, but a conversation.
Yes. And if it was a correspondence conversation, as I believed it was, then it's just the written word that we have to interpret. If it was an interview, then it could have been perhaps interpreted in a different way. So I'm kind of going in his defense a little bit.
Fair enough.
I don't think, he wasn't an angel, and, he upset a lot of people. And if you talk about politics and religion, and, he was quite strongly opinionated on that, and that's fine. But my kind of take on it was that it was all in good faith. I actually picked up earlier this morning, Amira's book on the Messier objects. Messier didn't actually discover all of those objects either. So this wasn't a play on discovering things. It was just a very humble list. So perhaps no different to a list that Alistair may put together, or we might put together as amateurs to, collect our favorite objects and then tick them off as we look. The only difference is that it had Patrick's name behind it, and maybe that was taken advantage of by the Patrick machine, and put into Shane's Nexus DSC, which I have as well, which is a fabulous bit of kit. It drives my 18-inch as well, or whether it's Stephen James O'Meara's book. It's happened. It's there. Love it or loathe it. In my view, life's too short. It's a bit of fun, the hobby. If you want to change the name or take Caldwell out and still go hunting those objects and tick them off, it's still an exercise to be done. I'm pretty sure there was no hard feelings or anything wrong in his creation of that list. That's my humble opinion.
Fair enough. Yeah, I sort of read, there's been there was online conversation just after it was published, which was around the time when I was getting into astronomy myself in the 90s. And I remember reading that and sort of thinking, that's interesting. Still, though, I've bought the O'Meara book on it, and I've observed not all, but many of the targets in there. It's an interesting selection. I'll put it that way. Some of them are kind of tough, even some of the early ones. I
agree.
But yeah, like you said, it is a list, and anything that kind of encourages people to get out and observe. To be frank, when we had that conversation with Alistair, and a lot of it was sort of in good spirit and good humor, I kind of had hoped that we would sort of hear from somebody and say, hey, I have a different opinion, and I really would like to give you that opinion, or hopefully even somebody like yourself that knew Patrick Moore. And then I kind of sort of enjoyed the fact that you did reach out, and then we had that conversation, and now you've been on to kind of present that sort of alternative view, having known what Patrick words sound like coming from his mouth about this topic. Anyway, really appreciate that, Stefan. Do you have any concluding remarks before we wrap the show?
I'd just like to sort of thank you both, Chris and Shane, for allowing me to come on the show and rant about my journey.
Good.
It's been a great pleasure to meet you. I thoroughly enjoy your shows. It gives me it helps to keep the hobby of mine going when I'm busy doing other things. It kind of brings me back sometimes when we're in the summer and the nights are not long, and that's something in the background I really enjoy doing. It has got me to spend some money, unfortunately, because eyepieces are not cheap, not as expensive as the one that you've recently bought, Chris. But yeah. So the hobby is what it is, but we're a small community. I love what we do. I love what you do, and please keep it up for us overseas. We'll spread the word. Pleasure meeting you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Anything to add from your end, Shane?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Really enjoyed getting to know you. Really enjoyed your journey and just your personal stories about Patrick Moore. I found very interesting. One thing too that really struck a chord with me was when you mentioned, and you mentioned it a couple times, but in particular early on with the astronomy club, feeling like a bit of an imposter. And I can certainly relate to that. Early on in my, real telescope days, joining a club, the local club here, I just assumed you needed to know an awful lot about astronomy or have a university degree in astronomy to sit at the table. So it was quite intimidating for me to go to my first meeting, but I quickly learned that, it's a very like-minded group of people that are very welcoming, and in being able to share the hobby with others really amplifies the enjoyment, at least for me. And I'm just glad you mentioned that, because I think probably more people listening, or others that are listening, probably have had a similar experience or maybe feeling that right now. And it's just a good thing to kind of acknowledge and move on and know that, the only thing that really matters is looking up at the stars and seeing some cool things. And that's really what we're all about. So thank you, Stefan. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. So true comments. That's hit the mark, really hit the nail on the head with that, I think. And it's, don't be fearful of it. You don't have to have that degree and that knowledge. Just go out and learn and explore and have fun. And it is a community that's sharing. It genuinely is. It's a great place to be.
Well, thanks for that, Shane. Thanks, Stefan. And thank you to our listeners for listening. Please share the show with other stargazers you know. And if you want to send us your show ideas, observations, or questions, you can always reach us at actualastronomy@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.